Welcome to Dancing in the World, the podcast that reveals cultural confluences and dance practices across the globe. My name is Kate Spanos.
And I'm Sinclair Emogene.
And today we're talking about migrations in and out of mainstream spaces and the advantages and disadvantages that we may experience through those migrations.
So, Kate, tell us about your experience as someone who may have moved through mainstream, non-mainstream.
Yeah, I started Irish dancing, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, when I was a kid. When I was young, my mom taught me how to do the 3s and 7s, which are the basics of Irish dancing. And I grew up, kind of just going to my classes, and people in my school thought I was weird. I would dance at the talent shows or on St. Patrick's Day, and I'd do my little jig. And it was always kind of like, isn't that cute, And then I started in 1990. And in 1994, suddenly everything for Irish dancing changed. Whereas we hadn't really seen what a mainstream might look like in Irish dancing, at least in the diasporic experience in the US. Suddenly it was like Irish dancing had this global stage. It was cool. It was sexy. It was like we wore these little black dresses instead of the traditional costumes. And it really changed a lot for me. And one of the major things that came out of Riverdance was the creation of a program in Irish dance, a undergraduate and graduate study in Irish dance at the University of Limerick. And I remember hearing about it when I was in high school, and I wasn't going to go the professional dance route, but eventually I knew that this master's program existed, and when I turned 25, I thought I have to go to Ireland and experience this before my knees go out or before I can't dance anymore,
And so how did you feel in Ireland? Did you feel subjugated in any way?
When I first got there, it was like fame for Irish dancers, like dancing in the hallways, people playing flutes in the elevators. It was just like, my first semester of the 1-year program was so exhilarating. I had never been in a place where I was just accepted. Like, everyone there was expected to have Irish dance experience. It wasn't like, oh, you need to be able to do pirouettes or you need to be able to do pliés and all. No, it was, how many twists can you do? How high can you jump? Like, all of that was what the standard was. And it was a very high standard for Irish dance. So it was wonderful to be there and be in Ireland in a program that was the norm. Irish dancing was the norm. We weren't on the margins of the program.
Did you feel like you coming from the U.S., did you feel like you were
that's
marginalized in any
what
way?
was complicated. And, we've talked about this, how after my first semester, it suddenly started to dawn on me that there was a kind of prejudice, really, against Americans, and I learned the term out-patty the patty. And I didn't think that I was participating in this at all. And looking back, sometimes I try to find, what did I do or say? I don't know. But I got really even more quiet and withdrawn than I already was. I think maybe I got excited when I was there, and at first I was like, this is where I belong. And then there was a sense of like, hold on, don't get too excited because don't forget that you're American and you didn't grow up here. And I was told specifically that because I wasn't born in Ireland, I would never be able to do the rhythms correctly. I mean, it was really down to the embodiment. You're never going to have the correct rhythm. You have like an American sensibility about your rhythms. And I got really insecure because of that. And then coming back to the U.S., I was in this nowhere space. Where do I belong? I had grown so much in Ireland. I came back to the U.S. wanting to do more of that. But now I was back on the margins of the dance scene. The traditionalists in the U.S. didn't want to see the more contemporary work that we'd done in Ireland. And then if I wanted to go back into the traditional world, it just felt the traditional world as it's defined in the U.S., which is different. It's preserving, right, from a specific period of time. and you're not allowed to go outside of the margins of the traditions. And we've talked a lot about this, the push and pull of tradition and how do we innovate within these forms. So I'm going to turn the questions back to you. You've had quite a migration and an experience coming from Nigeria.
Yeah, so I think the difference between your experience, right, about moving to Ireland and feeling kind of that diasporic feeling, being an outsider in a place where you think is your homeland, right? I had the other kind of experience where I completely owned my homeland. I was the traditionalist in Nigeria, performing at all these national events, and then moving to America. Still carrying that sense of privilege, right? So I know my culture, I know who I am, but in some ways began to feel there is a burden that comes with carrying culture in your body, and I think that was what I started feeling, that the expectations of me in America, which then tend to box me into this, you're traditional, you cannot be anything else.
Right.
Where, like you, the people in Ireland had opportunity to kind of be contemporary with it. And in Nigeria, we had the same thing. In Nigeria, I could be contemporary because as artists ourselves, we make works because of social issues. We make works because of our conditions. And artists are artists everywhere. And I was making works in Nigeria because of my situation. So I had the liberty to break out of that tradition when I wanted, use different cultures the way I wanted to do them. I didn't have that in America. It all of a sudden felt like the social issues that were happening, I couldn't participate in them, right? Because who am I? Yeah, and you're supposed to be the African dancer, the traditional dancer. Just do that and keep quiet. And that was very limiting for me. But then that placed me in a position where I'm thinking, I don't belong anywhere, right? And I say this not because I'm trying to cry for pity, but in Nigeria, I'm also a minority person. I'm Urobo, I am not part of the major groups. And so I developed my dancing to meet up, to get visibility in the field of Nigerian dance. And so I did that for years and got the recognition that I needed to have. And so having fought that and coming here and then becoming a minority again on kind of a different level is a task. Right now I have to fight again, and yeah, that's stressful.
It's sort of similar to what I was saying about going to Ireland and in my first semester feeling like I was in the majority.
Yes.
For the first time, I wasn't on the margins. It was like, these are my people, And sometimes I think, did I feel like these are my people in terms of Irish dancers and Irish musicians, or in terms of Ireland? And, it kind of, for me, as a member of the Irish diaspora, brings up the question of, like, what am I a part of the diaspora? Which diaspora am I a part of? Is it the Irish dance diaspora or the Irish diaspora?
How is it defined, yeah.
And those are sort of different things. Obviously, they're related. But this is really what we're talking about when we're saying that we experience these, like, going in and out of the mainstream or feeling like we're accepted as part of the majority or as part of just the standard, right? What's expected, versus suddenly like the suspicion, or like, is it a suspicion in my case, like, oh, you don't think you're too Irish, But then here, a suspicion like, what's that? Why don't you move your arms? Like these weird, things that people think are weird about the cultures that we participate in, that we represent.
We have to meet different types of expectations, right? That's crazy. If dance is supposed to be dance and fun, right? Meeting expectation is crazy. The other thing that I was thinking, diaspora, like I think about that term as a very confining terms, but also very loose term. There, for example, there are people who are diaspora people, and they have their own identity, their own rich culture, and through time, they've developed that. it's a system. They've had experiences that led them to develop that. I do not think I can call myself that because I'm not part of that lineage, that legacy. I don't think I have experienced that or have people who experience that and pass down to me. So in that sense, I try to not present myself as a diaspora, even though I'm from Africa, right? So that becomes the question: what do I call myself? Immigrant, on the other hand, sounds appealing, right? Because I am an immigrant. I'm a recent immigrant, in fact, to America, and but I find that there is a problem with the idea of immigration, migrating to a different location, because the practice that I have is an embodied practice, and when you cross geographical lines the way I have, you begin to pull attitudes, cultural codes from the places that you're visiting, going to. And so at some point, you have to sit down to evaluate your embodied knowledge. And when you start doing that, you find that you are not really as authentic as you thought you were back home, that you're something else. And now you have to define what this new thing is. Through that, you can then present yourself in the world. So it takes a while, and I've been doing that for the past 10 years. I'm thinking, who am I? What do I do?
Yeah.
Right? How do I define myself? I still think I'm African. I don't think that will go anywhere. I'm a proud African. I love my African community. I love Nigeria. But I am not there anymore physically. I'm here. Can I still be Nigerian? Can I still be practicing dance, right? So I think that's a definition that I think will come in the
Yeah.
future. But for now, I'm just going to be in the space of nowhere.
Well, and I think that's a really important, idea, just accepting the idea of being nowhere, so to speak. Because I think that the way that the dance field, and so much in the US, but let's just stick with dance for our conversations, is based on this idea that we have to define ourselves. And many of the categories that we are required to define ourselves by are things that we may not want to be the prominent characteristics that we identify with. Race, ethnicity, gender, class, all of these different categories that we're told, well, you need to position yourself, which is, of course, I believe important to position oneself in terms of those markers. But it creates so many anxieties, and to think like, well, am I as Irish as I should be? Am I forgetting about my Greek side? But I'm really American. Like, I grew up here, obviously. So what should I be displaying? And, through the body. And in dance, that's such a clear representation of what we're trying to represent or trying to display culturally. So I think what I like about our conversations and this idea that we do move in and out of mainstream is that we also move in and out of these categories. And as we move through spaces, migrate, immigrate, whatever, we change. And that's okay,
Yes. Yeah, I think when people hear us say move in and out of mainstream, it kind of raises this suspicion about, is Kate trying to not be white because we can see Kate being white, Kate,
Yeah.
or is Sinclair trying to avoid being a male presenting human, and that is not supposed to be the case. I think what we essentially are saying is, if we recognize that we flow in and out of these categories, we would be able to evaluate ourselves and watch our steps more consciously. And we will be able to diversify our understanding of what we are in the world, right? It creates sort of a nice check and balance for the artist. So when you're making a walk, like when I was making a walk at the Kennedy Center, and I was talking about a black man being killed on stage. I knew the privilege that I had to have that conversation. I was talking about a black Nigerian man being killed on stage because Nigerian men get killed in Nigeria by Nigerians. But I can see how that conversation relates to America, black males being killed by the police, or being incarcerated. And that's not the conversation I'm having, right? That is completely separate. But the presentation of that makes it one. So I understand that I had a voice and I was given an opportunity, a privilege to move into that mainstream, to have that conversation. But I couldn't say that I have all the experience to be African American,
Right.
right? Or represent the whole black people in this world. Um, that gives me a nice check to say, this is your moment of privilege. But then doesn't mean that you have all the privilege because you're still a black man in this world that is subjugated to different racial and political marginalization.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I think these questions about, the racial markings, the ethnic markings that we are subject to because of the society that we live in, either here in the US or globally. I mean, it's different everywhere, but what we're experiencing, let's make it very local here in Washington, is really interesting. So we'll take a quick break and then I think come back and continue this conversation about how people see us.
Yes.
So when we're dancing, our bodies are on full display. There's kind of no way to avoid that. It's very visual, perhaps also sonic if you're a percussive dancer. But really, people are looking at our bodies, and so many assumptions come along with what people see, and based on their own idea of who we are, what we represent, based on what we look like. And one of the conversations that I think is really interesting to have is the assumptions that people have about what kind of dance you do versus what kind of dance I do.
Right. I mean, people look at me and they go, "Yeah, African dance." Yeah. And so when they engage with my practice and they see that I do ballroom dancing, I go to salsa dancing, I do line dancing, and then I do different types of African dances. I do modern dance sometimes and contemporary Western dance. And it perplexes people. They don't know what to think about me. They think, oh, you're supposed to be African dancer. What is that? And that raises questions, right? Of is that efficacy or why are you able to do that, or you're just parading, mimicking these forms, and that questions my intellectual ability on many levels, right? Because I have trained to do these forms.
Yeah.
I'm not just doing them. I have different certificates to show that I am a qualified dancer. I'm a certified ballroom dancer. So I can teach that, I can perform that. But people don't see me as that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm framed in this very marked category of black African dancer.
And kind of on the other side of it, people see me and they say, oh, look, a thin white woman, looks like you must do ballet or at least modern dance. And I do take jazz classes regularly, and I show up with my little ponytail, and I fit right in. And then as soon as we start doing pirouettes, it's like, oh, you maybe you haven't trained in this your whole life, And I kind of take issue with the assumption that I am a dancer, an unmarked dancer, because I'm so proud of the fact that I'm an Irish dancer specifically. And to me, Irish dancing has so many different important qualities that we train so hard. There's the percussive element, the loud, percussive. There's the graceful, elegant style. And there's so many styles within Irish dancing anyway. And I'm really, really proud of the fact that I grew up doing that form, and that people often say, oh, but was that really your first form? Yes, that was the first form that I trained, and the one that I have trained every day since then. And I've done other forms as well, and going into Brazilian dance, which I started about 15 years ago, it was like I had such a strong foundation already for who I was that I felt comfortable in trying other forms as well, which I know represents a certain amount of privilege as well, that I could go into these different spaces and take Brazilian dance, West African class, but not feel like I was masquerading as another culture, but feeling I'm coming to this from a very, very specific cultural grounding, and I'm branching out to see what it's like in other forms as well.
Yeah. So some of when you were talking, I think some of the things that we can think of is what that sense of neutrality of your being gives you to move freely through the space. Um, what that gives you, like as a dancer, the kind of the first assumption when people look at you, go, yeah, a dancer, right? What doors open because of that
Yeah.
sense of neutrality, and then what doors closes. For me, when people look at me, oh, Africa, we don't need that now, right?
Right.
Or if I present myself to be able to do other things, suspicion, can he really do that, right? So I think that's the conversation we're having here, right? How do we move through these spaces and what the assumptions are, which in our both cases we're being impeded, right? So you, the neutrality is not helping your case.
Right. Right.
And me, the sort of marked categories, this framework, confining me here it isn't making a case for me to be successful. So how do we go about our
Yeah.
unmarking and marking?
Yeah.
If that
Yeah,
helps.
like when I want to be marked, But I also like it when I'm not marked. Like I've told you about, I've gone to classes, like jazz classes, with people that I know from the Brazilian dance community. And they look at me and I didn't know you were also a real dancer. And in a way, I'm like, oh, I am also a real dancer. I can do a jeté or whatever. But then at the same time, it's like, well, what? Why is that not real dance when it's hard. Just like so many dances are, it's not like we're just hopping around. And not even to say that just hopping around is
Right.
anything negative, but serious, serious training over many years. So this idea of a real dancer, which is unmarked culturally, and there's an assumption, my students always come in with this idea that, they're going to be, that dance is just this one thing, or we're going to be studying cultural dances, which are not real dance that you see on stage. And how do we break that down? And in this moving in and out of the mainstream, when do we take advantage of this unmarkedness or markedness and vice versa? Because we can always find times that we want to be marked and when we don't want to be marked.
Correct. So privilege is sweet, right?
Yeah.
So when privilege presents itself, we take it. But I think it takes extra kind of awareness to be conscious when that happens. And I always tell dancers, those moments where you are being privileged, watch out for the person that is not being privileged at all. Because I've had situations where some people are presented as dancers, and in front of them, they're talking about the person that is not a dancer and how that person needs to be trained or needs to have some things, and they're saying it as if it's a helpful feedback, if you will, to make them better. And they're saying this so casually. But then dancers who know should be able to stand up and say, no, what you're saying is actually racist, is actually out of context.
Yeah.
You need to apologize because they have a cultural knowledge that is as steep as yours and as fundamentally, right, more developed, as developed as yours. So we have to stand up for ourselves when we are in these positions. And I think this book does provide that sort of language for people to say, well, yeah, that is your sensibility about this, oh, can you think about it this other way? This person has something to offer. Let's do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so much of this conversation is related to the idea that we are looking for different things when we dance. And it really depends on the spaces that we're in. Are we training to dance on stage in front of people? Are we training, so to speak, to dance with other people in a social situation, which requires sometimes just as much cultural preparation, if not more.
Right.
And we'll talk about that more in future episodes, the aesthetic training and the technique that is required. So in the next episode, we'll be talking about dance as play and what dance looks like in different communities.